Good morning, buenos dias, buen dia, and welcome to our webinar, World Energy Outlook, Trends and Perspectives on Energy Efficiency in Latin America. We're very happy to have you here today. My name is Edith Bayer, and I'm joined by my colleague, Stephanie Buchart. Stephanie is on the team that undertakes the modeling and analysis that go into our World Energy Outlook, and I work on the team responsible for energy efficiency and focus in particular on Latin America. Before we begin, just a couple of notes on the platform we're using. The platform is GoToWebinar, which allows participants to connect via internet or phone. If you have trouble with your sound during the webinar, you can remain connected to view slides on the computer and call in for audio using a toll-free number. You see a link here on the slide for toll-free numbers, which you've also received when you were emailed the confirmation of your registration. We've also sent around copies of today's presentation translated into Portuguese and Spanish for your reference, and we'll make a recording of the presentation and copies of the presentation in all languages available online after the webinar. We welcome your comments throughout the webinar, and we've left time at the end for questions and answers. Please enter your questions as they come to you into the questions box, which you can see on your screen here. I'd like to tee off the presentation with a question, which is, what does it mean when we say that energy efficiency is the first fuel? Many of you will be familiar with the term, which the IEA frequently cites. In 2013, going back a bit, we published our first energy efficiency market report, and in that report we framed energy efficiency as the first fuel, given its role in supplying a significant portion of the world's energy demand. We found that without energy efficiency, global demand would have been 2/3 higher from 2005 to 2010. So fast forward to today. Subsequent analyses have shown the value of energy efficiency as a cost-effective resource to meet rising energy demand, to aid the transition to clean energy sources, mitigate cost, reduce emissions, and accelerate access to electricity. However, despite significant investment in energy efficiency, in 2017 we saw 3% growth up to $236 billion in 2017. We see a slowdown in the pace of advancement of policies and investment, and this is worrying in the context of cost-effectively meeting the challenges of climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. For these reasons and many more, we've decided to focus today's presentation on the role of energy efficiency in the broader energy context. Today's webinar is a continuation of a dialogue on energy efficiency with many of you in Latin America, including in Mexico, Brazil, and other countries in the region. We look forward to continuing this dialogue in the question and answer session today, and with the help of your feedback following the webinar. Today's presentation focuses on energy efficiency within the context of observed and projected trends in demand growth, including accelerating growth and energy demand in emerging economies, the implications of rapid electrification, the continuing challenge to meet Sustainable Development Goals. I'd now like to hand over the mic to my colleague, Stephanie Buchart.
Thanks, Edith, for this introduction. So, to start with, we'll start with the context of the energy sector today at the global scale. So, we have quite mixed signals from today's energy scene. For example, on the oil sector, we have seen remarkable recent growth in US shale. I mean, this is really the story of the moment. But elsewhere, there are many uncertainties around geopolitics, Venezuela situation, and this creates risks of volatility. Concerning the gas markets, the mood has quite changed compared to previous years. Not long time ago, we were talking about a gas glut, but consumers, led mostly by China, have responded. And now we are seeing a big growth of gas demand around the world. In terms of renewables, solar PV is really charging ahead, albeit not quite at the rate of last year, and other technologies are also showing great promises like offshore wind and storage. But rates of growth are not being matched across the board. We have seen that onshore wind capacity additions have been falling year on year, and there are indications that the flow of new energy efficiency policies may be slowing. which is quite annoying. In terms of emissions, we have assessed that emissions are back on a rising trend in the year 2018, and that they have reached a historic high in that year. This trajectory for energy-related emission is far out of step with the early peak in emissions that scientific knowledge says will be essential to tackle climate change. So this is quite an issue as well. But there are also some better news. So for the first time since we started to track the issue of electricity access, the number of people without access to electricity fell below 1 billion, which is quite good news because in 2000 we had 1.7 billion people without electricity access. In 2010 it was still 1.4 billion, and now we are below 1 billion, and most of the credit goes to India for this huge decline. But of course, there is still a long way to go to make sure that we reach universal access around the globe. So these are good news for electricity, and there are a lot of questions also around electricity. That's why it was a special focus of the World Energy Outlook 2018. There are huge opportunities for that fuel or vector, but there are a lot of questions too. How much of the world's demand can really be electrified? That could be one question. What do the power system of the future look like? Will it be fully renewables? How do we push renewables and so transformation that can achieve this decarbonization of the power sector? And to make sure that this power system is still reliable. Of course, there are multiple scenarios that can be assessed until 2040. We have a lot of uncertainties regarding the different fuels, regarding the different technologies. That's why in our publication we have multiple scenarios, including not only an assessment of today's policies intentions, so all the national determined contributions that were agreed under the Paris Agreement, but also a look at what will be required to deliver, as I said previously, full universal access to electricity and also clean cooking, a major reduction in air pollutants, and meeting climate change goals, which is what we do into our sustainable development scenario that we will discuss later on in this presentation. But we will focus first into the results of our new policy scenario. So, as I said, this was the context of today's energy scene. Now, as I said, also there are multiple pathways until 2040. So how do we project this energy demand by 2040? We are using a simulation model. So this is not an optimization model. This is a simulation model that is policy driven. So that's why we have three main scenarios, which are the current policy scenario, the new policy scenarios, and this sustainable development scenario. With this model, in terms of output, we have all the sectoral and regional energy demand balances for the different scenarios, as well as regional fuel production and trades. We can assess also the related greenhouse gas emissions, so CO2, CH4, and N2O. And each year, our colleagues from EASA assess the related local pollutants for three scenarios, so in terms of NOx, SOx, and PM from today to 2040. And finally, another big output that we have from our model is all the investments required for these energy systems, so into our three different scenarios. The investment related to oil, coal, and gas production, the investment related to the construction of new power plants, but also all the energy efficiency related investments. So the energy efficiency investments in the transport sector, in the industry sector, and in the building sector. Currently, the time horizon in our model is up to 2040, even though our model runs up to 2050. In terms of regional resolution, we split the world into 25 key regions. on the demand side, and we split the world into 120 regions on the supply side. We have into these 25 regions a lot of countries that are represented individually, such as the United States, China, India, but also Mexico and Brazil. So the other regions include also Central and South America within our model, and we will show some results specifically for these regions later on for our new policy scenario. So in terms of modules, we have first one module that looks at all the future energy demand for the main end-use sectors, so industry, transport, residential sector, the non-residential sector or services sector, agriculture, and all the feedstocks. Then we have the energy transformation sector, which includes the power and heat sector mostly, and all the refinery sector. And finally, the supply and trade sector that looks at all the coal, oil, gas, and bioenergy production. So that's for the model. Now let's move on with some key results. So if we look now at what was the energy demand back in 2000, the world was quite different because the United States and European Union were really the dominant players of the energy system at that time. The key development that we have seen since 2000 has been the incredible rise of China in terms of global energy, taking over from the United States as the world's largest energy consumer, as you can see on that figure, which shows you the total primary energy demand in terms of million tons of oil equivalent. Then if we look forward, we see into our model that the structural changes that will happen in China's economy mean that the growth will slow down to 1/5 of the pace that we had seen since 2000. So India sees the biggest increase. As you can see, from today to 2040, India overtakes European Union in terms of total primary energy demand. The increasing policy focus on energy efficiency in the EU countries, including new targets agreed earlier last year, means that the EU uses 20% less energy in 2040 than today. In terms of Central and South America, we can see that this follows as well a big growth in terms of total primary energy demand, although at a lower pace compared to China, India, and Africa. Even though by 2040, demand in Africa also overtakes that of the European Union, but it remains by far the lowest consumer of energy on a per capita basis. So that's the shape of energy demand by region. As I said, into our model, we have also the split by sector and by fuel. So if we want to assess who meets this new energy demand from today to 2040, we are seeing, we will show you all the different fuels, but first let's discuss about the fuel that we cannot see, which is energy efficiency. So energy efficiency into our new policy scenario means that the growth of energy demand has been halved. It could have been the double of what we have shown you in the previous slide if we didn't have energy efficiency. So it's a very powerful tool to make sure that we can slow the growth of energy demand. Now, if we look at the other technologies, so first the low carbon technologies, renewables and nuclear enables to mean a lot of the growth of total primary energy demand, so mostly renewables, given that they reach, they enable to meet 45% of the increase in primary energy demand, which is almost half of the growth. So lower costs mean that renewable accounts for 2/3 of capacity additions in the power sector, and solar PV capacity rises above coal by 2040. this is really the first time that we see this into our scenario, into our new policy scenario. So as a result, renewables also swap places with coal in the generation mix. Coal currently accounts for 40%, renewables account currently for 25% in the generation mix, and they swap places as renewables will account for 40% by 2040 and coal for 25% by 2040. Now, let's discuss about gas, another big fuel in terms of growth of future energy demand. Around 80% of the growth comes from developing economies, as you can see, so on the right-hand side of the figure for gas. And the biggest component for the growth is not power, in fact, but it's industry. Industry is larger than power because gas is used in industry both as a way to generate heat that is used to produce glass, steel, cement, ceramics, but gas is also used in industry as a raw material for a range of chemicals such as methanol, ammonia, and so on. Now, oil. In terms of oil, there is a stronghold of oil demand in transport that is coming from fuel efficiency and fuel switching. But oil continues to grow because of aviation, shipping, and above all, petrochemicals. So that's why in the developing economies, even though you still have a lot of fuel economy that is put in place, and that you have still a lot of fuel switching from traditional cars to electric vehicles or to electric buses, you still have a big growth for oil demand for cars, but most of the growth will also come from petrochemicals, aviation, and shipping. Finally, coal, which is the big loser in terms of fuel. It declines in the power sector in advanced economies, but note that also in China, where coal consumption falls by the equivalent of European Union's coal use today, which is quite large as well. So that was the global scale. That was the global picture in terms of future energy demand by the growth by 2040 from today. That was for advanced economies and developing economies. Now, if we look specifically at two countries from Latin America, which are Mexico and Brazil, which are modeled separately into the World Energy Model, we can see that the picture is quite different from the global one. In Mexico and Brazil, the biggest growth will come from renewables, like in the other countries, but there will be a bigger difference compared to gas compared to the other regions. In terms of coal, of course, Mexico and Brazil doesn't use much of these fuels. That's why we don't see a big difference from today to 2040. In terms of gas, you can see that in Brazil there is not a big expectation of growth of gas into the power sector, but that most of the gas increase will come as well as for other developing economies from the industry sector. So now if we look at one specific fuel, which is not shown on this picture, which is electricity, because electricity is not at the scale of total primary energy demand, but should be looked at the total final consumption, given that it's consumed directly by end-use sector, so buildings, transport, and industry. We had seen that at the global level, electricity is increasingly the fuel of choice for meeting the needs of households and companies. Since 2000, global electricity demand has grown by 3% a year, which is around 2/3 faster than total final consumption. And it currently accounts for 90% of total final consumption, compared to just over 15% in 2000. In terms of total final electricity consumption, electricity is now the second largest fuel, but it remains less than half the level of oil at the global level. So this is the picture from 2000 to 2017, and in the new policy scenario, the role of electricity expands. So electricity demand increases by 60% and grows at twice the rate of overall energy demand, at 2.1%. Similarly to the last 15 years, developing economies continue to dominate this growth, accounting for nearly 90% of the growth. China, India together accounts for around half of the growth, and demand in advanced economies rises modestly due to policies promoting the electrification of heat and mobility. By 2040, developing economies account for 2/3 of global electricity demand. Electricity demand in China is more than twice than that of the United States, with India a not too distant third, although its per capita consumption remains one of the world's lowest, still higher than Africa. And in the period to 2040, in the new policy scenario, 680 million people gain access to electricity. But these additional people add only a mere 3% to overall demand growth of electricity. So from 2000 to 2017, we have seen that, we can see on this figure that in advanced economies, electricity demand had started to flatten, and we can also wonder why we have seen this flatten. But this picture was also quite different in developing economies, as we can see on the graph. And if we look specifically at Latin America countries, we can see that since 2000, electricity demand has grown, but at very different pace in Mexico, in Brazil, and in other Latin American countries, at quite a strong pace. And we see that electricity demand will continue to grow, and this growth is mainly driven by buildings, given the increased uptake of cooling systems within houses, within commercial buildings, and that's why we see this growth of electricity demand in the new policy scenario from today to 2040. But as I said, we had seen that electricity demand has flattened in advanced economy, and we can wonder if we will observe any such trends also in developing economies. So, in fact, we have assessed into the World Energy Outlook 2018 that electricity demand has fallen in 18 out of the 30 IEA member countries since 2010. Several factors have slowed growth in electricity demand in advanced economies, but the key reason of that slowdown is energy efficiency. Because we have assessed that the new sources of electricity demand growth, which are electrification of heat and mobility and also digitalization, holds great promises for the future, but these sources have only slightly increased electricity demand by 350 terawatt-hours from 2000 to today, and you can see that electricity demand in advanced economies reach almost 10,000 terawatt-hours, so 350 terawatt-hours is quite small compared to that amount. So without electrification, the electricity demand that we could have observed would have been quite similar to what we have observed, given that today electric cars represent around 1% of all passenger vehicle sales in those economies, and since 2000, around 7% of households have switched from fossil fuels, so mostly gas, to electricity for space and water heating. And electricity satisfies less than 5% of heat demand in the industrial sector. But these sources of growth, as I said previously, have been more than outpaced by savings from the energy efficiency policies that had been put in place since the year 2000. In the absence of energy efficiency, electricity demand will have grown at 1.6% per year since 2010, instead of the 0.3% that we have observed since then. It means that energy efficiency measures saved almost 1,800 terawatt-hours in 2017, which is around 20% of the current electricity used in advanced economies. Over 40% of the slowdown in electricity demand was attributable to the industry sector and largely a result of strict minimum energy performance standards for electric motors, which cover almost half of their electricity use in these countries. And by the end of 2017, almost all of electricity used for fridge, freezers, air conditioners in advanced economies was subject to minimum energy performance standards. In developing economies, even though we have seen that electricity demand was still growing and that it has almost tripled since 2000 up to today, from 4,500 terawatt-hours to more than 1,200 terawatt-hours, energy efficiency measures that had been put in place in developing economies over this period helped to avoid an additional 1,400 terawatt-hours of electricity demand in 2017, which is lower compared to what we have seen in advanced economies, but which is still quite important. So we have seen that in advanced economies, but also in developing economies, energy efficiency has already shaped the current electricity demand, and that it enabled to slow down the growth in those regions. The question now is, what will be the role of energy efficiency in the future? So if we look now at the electricity demand in 2017 by sector and the share of electricity for these sectors within the total final consumption, we can see into this graph that is split between advanced economies and developing economies that most of the electricity is consumed within buildings and industry. In the transport sector, the contribution, as I said previously, of electric cars is quite negligible. It accounts for less than 0.1% of total electricity demand. If we look at the growth to 2040 in both advanced economies and developing economies, we can still see that by 2040, the building sector remains the most important sectors in terms of driver of global electricity demand in the new policy scenario. There are many elements that explain this trend. Today, around 30% of households worldwide own an air conditioner, and this number will increase by 2040. Only 13% of households use electricity for heating, and this number also will increase by 2040. And as I said at the beginning, there are nearly 1 billion people without access to electricity. And in addition, electricity needs for information and communication technologies are on the rise in an increasingly digitalized world. The second contributing sector is the industry sector. It remains also an important driver of electricity demand growth. China's industrial motor system are the single largest contributor to global electricity demand growth to 2040. And the China electricity motors growth to 2040 account for almost a fifth of the total electricity demand growth from today to 2040. So a single sector in a single region accounts for a fifth of the global growth electricity demand. So just to clarify a few things, you can see the dots, which are the share of electricity in TFC, TFC meaning total final consumptions, so all the consumption done in every single sectors for all the fuels, so accounting for coal, oil, gas, electricity, heat, and renewables. When I mentioned a few times also WEO means World Energy Outlook, which is one of our publications, and this is where all the results come from, the results that we are showing to you today. So it's one of our annual publications that we have here at the IEA. So to come back to this growth of electricity demand, I was talking about buildings, then industry as the two key components, but you can see also that transport will increase by 2040. And the key difference that we have between industry buildings and transport is that most of the growth for industry and buildings will come from developing economies, while for transport, the growth will come from both advanced economies and from developing economies, given that the switch from traditional cars to electric vehicles will happen at the global scale. But energy efficiency will play a big role also by 2040, not only for all the fuels, but also mostly for electricity. Energy efficiency really acts as a brake on increasing demand for many end uses for electricity. The growth of electricity demand could have been 60% higher without energy efficiency improvements. So it means MEPs for appliances and cooling systems. So MEPs are mandatory energy performance standards for appliances, cooling systems, but also industrial electric motors. A particular area of improvement is that of data centers, which could see an important growth of electricity demand due to their needs for cooling. But energy efficiency improvements also comes from the more stringency of building codes, and we have seen the implementation of building codes in both advanced economy and developing economies. Now, we have seen that electricity was a big component of our future electricity mix, energy mix, that it's currently also a big component. As I said, it accounts for almost a fifth of total final consumption for end-use sectors. In our publication, so our World Energy Outlook publication that we have published last year in 2018, we have looked at an additional scenario. So I have showed you results related to new policy scenarios that includes all the policies that are currently in place. I will discuss later on results from our sustainable development scenario, but we had looked at an additional case, which is the future is electric. We have introduced this future is electric scenario to examine, in fact, three key areas of uncertainty for future electricity demand in end-use sectors. So the first key uncertainty is in buildings. The first one is linked to the provision of electricity access. So we have assessed in this scenario that universal access is achieved by 2030, and that households who have recently gained access to electricity own more rapidly electric appliances such as fridge, fans, and additional cooling systems. Another key uncertainty in the building sector is how digital our future economy will be. So we have assessed in this scenario that electricity demand implication of a faster uptake of network-enabled digital appliances, and that this will create higher demand in homes and from data centers. So that's the additional uptake that we see in the future electric scenario that you can see in this figure. And finally, that's something I have mentioned in the previous slides. A lot of end users rely only or almost on electricity, but the question is also how far can we electrify heating? So heating needs for both space and water heating. In many regions, these technologies, so using electricity for heating, are not yet economically competitive with fossil fuel counterparts, so such as gas boiler or LPG boilers. And in the future is electric scenario, we have assessed the economic potential of electricity for heating, and we have assessed that policies succeed in removing non-economic barriers, such as higher upfront costs, split incentives, and all these kind of barriers that could prevent of a higher uptake of electricity for heating purposes. Another sector where heating needs are mostly met by fossil fuels is industry. In the future is electric scenario, we have assumed an increased uptake of heat pumps for low temperature heat, but we have also assumed a switch from natural gas to decarbonized energy to generate hydrogen feedstock for ammonia production. And we have assessed an increased use of electric arc furnaces for steel making. As for buildings, this potential for electricity demand has been assessed based on the economic potential of technology. So it's not the technology, the technical potential, but it's based on the economic potential. So that was for buildings and industry, but of course there is another key sector which could see a bigger growth in terms of electricity, which is the transport sector. So after many decades of the dominance of oil-based fuels in the transport energy mix, the question was, to what extent can electricity become the main energy source for providing mobility? And in this futurist electric scenario, so we have once again assessed what is the economic potential for all these electric vehicles. So not only the cars, but also 2 3-wheelers, trucks, and buses. And by 2040, there are 950 million cars, which is almost nearly half of the total fleet of over 2 billion at the global level. There are also 74 million electric light commercial vehicles and 15 million electric heavy-duty vehicles, including buses and trucks that you can see on the right-hand side figure. Also, in terms of 2 3-wheelers, about 70% of them are electrified too by 2040. So achieving this level of electrification of mobility will require a massive rollout of charging infrastructure for all these new vehicles on the road. But beyond the road and rail sectors, we have also looked at the technical feasibility of electrified transport for aviation and shipping, and the direct use of electricity for these modes have not been included into this scenario, into this future is electric scenario. So that's what it looks like in terms of all the assumptions that we have taken for this future is electric scenario, how much we can go in terms of electrifying end-use sectors if we look at their economic potential compared to their other counterparts. And we have here the results in terms of total final consumption in this futurist electric scenario. So you can see that, as I said at the beginning, currently the share of electricity within total final consumption is a fifth, so 90%. And now in the futurist electric scenario, we reach around a third of all final consumption that is electrified. That means that a third is electrified, but if we look at the share in terms of useful energy, this gives a better idea of how much of the end users are electrified or not. So you can see that in fact half of the end users are electrified, given that it gets, if we look at useful energy, we get rid of all the energy efficiency components of all the final consumption. I'll move on with our next slides that shows you the implications of greater electrification, so the difference between our new policy scenario and the future electric scenario. So you can see on this figure that the electricity demand between the two scenarios by 2040 is quite large, and the impact in terms of oil demand is quite important as well. Oil demand peaks by 2040 in this scenario and then declines, approaching today's level of demand by 2040. And finally, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, electrification provides an avenue to reduce both CO2 emissions but also air pollutant emissions. But energy sector carbon emissions could keep growing if we don't take stronger efforts to decarbonize also electricity supply. So in the last 5 years, renewables increased hugely, and in the new policy scenario, this strong growth accelerates by 50%. In the future electric scenario, renewables grow at close to double the pace in recent years, which is quite large, but you can see that the impact in terms of energy-related CO2 emissions is not striking, because we don't see the peak that we should see to reach the Paris Agreement. So now let's move on with our latest scenarios, which is the Sustainable Development Scenario. We have introduced this scenario a few years ago to include three key pillars. So not only climate change, so it relies on few USDG goals. So the first one is climate change. The second one is achieving universal access by 2030, achieving universal energy access, which means electricity access, but also clean cooking access, given that the traditional use of solid biomass is linked to a lot of indoor air pollution and premature death related to these pollutions, and reducing the impact of air pollution. In this scenario, energy efficiency is really a key component to achieve these reductions. So on the next slide, you can see the different benefits and the difference between our new policy scenario by 2040 and the Sustainable Development Scenario. So as I said, one key component is access. By 2040, we have a full access to electricity and clean cooking. Given that we rely less on the traditional use of solid biomass, it will reduce the number of premature deaths at the indoor level. But given that we will have also a higher switch to electricity and gas in industry, but also to electric vehicles in the transport sector, we have less outdoor air pollution and less premature deaths related to outdoor pollutions. And finally, carbon dioxide emissions peaks in that scenario and reduce dramatically compared to the new policy scenario already by 2040. How do we achieve that? As I said previously, energy efficiency is a very key component to achieve that reduction. So if we look at the reduction in terms of CO2 and CH4 emissions, so aggregating those two greenhouse gas emissions from today to 2040, you can see that we have an early peak, which is in line with the Paris Agreement, and the key components that enable us to achieve that big reduction, first and foremost, is energy efficiency in the end-use sector, so in industry, transport, and buildings, and also the fossil fuel subsidy reform, so phase out of fossil fuel in all importing countries, and slow removal in exporting countries. Then the second key component is renewables and the reduction of least efficient coal-fired power plants. And a third component is the reduction of upstream oil and gas methane emissions. And finally, nuclear, CCUS, fuel switching to other low carbon technologies are enabled to achieve the 20% additional reduction into this scenario. So maybe we'll have a bigger look now at the energy efficiency in some countries.
So yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So the next couple of slides demonstrate what we get if we take that top slice from the previous slide, from the Sustainable Development Scenario, and the end-use energy efficiency measures needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and break it down by sector and country, and specifically here for Brazil and Mexico, which, as was mentioned earlier, we model separately, and so we can show the results separately. EWS here refers to Efficient World Strategy, under which all cost-effective energy efficiency potential is met. And the strategy aligns with the energy efficiency gap that we see under the Sustainable Development Scenario between the new policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario. So this particular slide focuses on Brazil and demonstrates that we could achieve an additional 2 exajoules of energy savings by 2040 compared to what we would get if we only counted existing policies and policy commitments. This would mean that greenhouse gas emissions would remain the same in 2040 as at current level. It's important to point out that for Brazil, and this will be different for different countries, but the most energy savings potential lies in transport, nearly half. And this is followed by the energy savings potential in industry and buildings. In transport, the biggest potential lies in passenger transport, while in industry, we see a lot of potential in pulp and paper and iron and steel, including through an increase in metals recycling in particular. And now to show the same kind of analysis for Mexico. In Mexico, we see that implementing the cost-effective energy savings potential would mean avoiding 1 exajoule of avoided final energy use in 2040. And in this case, we would see greenhouse gas emissions lowered by 8% from current levels. Mexico has more evenly spread potential between transport, industry, and buildings. So transport is still the sector with the most potential. And in the case of Mexico, in transport, efficiency could be improved by increasing the fuel efficiency of trucks and cars. In industry, we see that the potential for efficiency gains are greatest in less energy-intensive manufacturing sectors like food, beverage, tobacco, and textile manufacturing. And it's useful to note here that, in fact, this breakdown of the potential in industry is what we see in the other countries and regions that we looked at. So in fact, we see the most potential for energy savings in industry in the less energy intensive industrial sectors, which may not be what comes to mind immediately to everyone. And the other point that I think it's worth making in these 2 slides is that, as you can see, while some of the earlier slides showed that we do anticipate that there would be significant improvements in energy efficiency and in energy intensity of economies under the new policies scenario, which takes into account existing and planned policies. In fact, to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and to meet this wedge, this yellow wedge of energy efficiency, we actually would need to step up ambition, and that, of course, has implications for policymakers and stakeholders and banks and others. So now I'll pass it back to Stephanie.
Yes. So these 2 last slides that Edith has shown you was focusing on the energy efficiency component of the sustainable development scenario. Here we have a few indicators that shows you the difference that we have for these indicators between the new policy scenarios and the sustainable development scenario. And you can see that there is a big need to accelerate the transition to these low carbon technologies. So in terms of renewables in the power sector, in terms of electric vehicles on the road by 2040, in terms of energy efficiency for these indicators on energy productivity, in terms of deployment of CCUS, and to decrease the share of non-fossil fuel energy in the energy system. So that's a big step forward that we need in this sustainable development scenario. What does that mean in terms of investment? If we look at the difference of investment between the new policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario, you can see that we have a decline between those 2 scenarios on the supply side, while on the power sector side, we have, of course, an increase for low carbon technology, so renewables, nuclear, and CCUS power plants, and T&D related investment. And on the end-use sectors, we have a bigger investment needed in terms of energy efficiency in industry, transport, and buildings. So the big difference between those 2 scenarios. But that means that, in fact, investments will be only 13% higher in the sustainable development scenario compared to our new policy scenario. An additional component, as I said, into our sustainable development scenario is access. and you can see on the right-hand side figure that the investments related to air pollution and access in these scenarios, the additional investments in the sustainable development scenario compared to our new policy scenario are quite small. You can see that there is a big difference of scale between the right-hand side figure and the left-hand side figure. So this key component could be achieved also by 2040 and will not be harmful for the investment in all the other components to reach the climate targets. So to conclude.
So I mean, I think we'll move quite quickly to the questions and answers, but just a few concluding remarks to recap some of the presentation. It's very clear to us that the geography of energy is changing in terms of where we're seeing the most growth projected to occur, and so when we think about Latin America and other regions and countries with emerging economies, energy efficiency will play a really important role there in terms of making sure that growth is efficient and cost effective and competitive. The rapid growth of electricity brings huge opportunities, but to meet the sustainable development goals, energy efficiency and renewable energy will be pivotal. Otherwise, as you saw, we actually can see a significant rise in electricity use without a concurrent reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The experience in advanced and emerging economies shows us over the past few decades that energy efficiency does have the ability to moderate growth in electricity demand. And the good news is that we've identified that there really is significant cost-effective energy efficiency potential in Latin American countries and throughout the world. And so the question really becomes one of how to unlock that potential and where the barriers may be, given that it's quite a distributed resource across the economy. And lastly, there's no single solution to turn emissions around. It's really a matter of deploying different technologies, and we don't mention it here in the conclusions, but behavior also plays an important role. And this will be driven by national and also, very importantly, local policy. So, I mean, two more points that I thought I would highlight. One is that this issue of cooling has come up a few times in terms of the role of cooling in electricity growth, and so that's an important area, particularly in a lot of the region that we're talking about today, given the higher temperatures. And I also think that in the electrification scenario, it's interesting to just highlight the share of useful energy that you get from electricity compared to other sources, which is where some of the efficiency benefit comes from. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and open the floor up to questions. We have a few questions that have come up. One of them relates to really, I think, to clarifying what we see in terms of electric vehicles in the new policy scenario compared to the electrification scenario.
Yeah. So the question wonders if we include the electric vehicles into our projections for the new policy scenario. Yes, we do. As I had shown on one figure, the electricity demand on the transport sector will increase in both advanced economies and emerging economies, given that we see an increase of electric car sales at the global level. But of course, this share is even higher in the futurist electric scenario because we assess the overall economic potential, given that we assess that we get rid of all the non-economic barriers, which are the high upfront costs and other barriers that could prevent consumers to buy new electric cars. There was also a quick clarification asked by one person. What means EAF? It means electric arc furnaces in the industry sector. one other question was related to the share of electricity in total final consumption, if it takes into account the primary energy demand. No, in the total final consumption, we look at all the energy that is consumed by the end-use sectors. So it takes into account all the efficiency of the technologies at the end-use sectors level, so the efficiency of a boiler compared to the efficiency of a heat pump. We look into that, and then at the total primary energy demand numbers, you will include also all the energy that was used to produce that electricity, and that includes thus the efficiency of all the power plants and also the efficiency of all the refining process.
So another question is whether we recommend approaches and directions for national policies and regulations on energy efficiency and renewable energy from the results of the World Energy Outlook 2018. And I suppose we can both answer this question. So I'll let so I mean the IEA has a lot of publications, and we have a lot of, I'd say, avenues through which we work. Within the Energy Efficiency Division, in our annual publication on energy efficiency, the Energy Efficiency Market Report, we include examples of case studies of policies that have been particularly effective in different countries. And we also have an online policies and measures database, which provides information that you can filter by type of policy and sector to understand what other countries are doing in this space. We also are working more directly in certain cases with governments and through different fora, including things like webinars, where if there was interest in a specific type of policy, we can give a webinar with examples of different kinds of policies. So I'd say there are a lot of different places where we have this kind of information and want to share it. And I would also add that we really count on our partners and counterparts in different countries to share with us their experiences, so we can consistently stay up to date and continue the conversation on policies for energy efficiency as well as for renewable energy and other energy sources.
To complement on that, so as Edith said in the conclusion, there is no single solution. So for each country, we should apply different solutions, and that's why in the World Energy Outlook each year we are focusing our analysis on one key country. In 2013, we did an analysis on Brazil. So if you are interested to look at our recommendations in terms of policies for energy efficiency and renewables, it was 6 years ago, but still the recommendations are still quite valid. Likewise, for Mexico, we did a special report a few years ago based on the policies that were in place and the recommendations to achieve higher reductions thanks to energy efficiency or thanks to the implementation of more renewables in the energy system.
So there are several questions relating to ESCOs, and we're at time, so we don't have a chance at the moment to go too deeply into this. But I would say that we've recently posted or published online a number of case studies of different countries, including several in Latin America. I think Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and I can't remember whether Argentina might be in there as well. We have, and also many countries from other regions, describing the state of the ESCO market, and we're continuing that work. We received a number of questions. We apologize of additional questions that we haven't been able to get to, so we apologize for not being able to address all of them, but we'll take them into account and try to continue the conversation informed by your various questions. Yeah, I don't know, Stephanie, if you have anything else that you wanted to address quickly.
Just one final comment, given a few questions that were asked. Each year for our World Energy Outlook, we update the assessments and our scenarios because, as I said, it's policy driven. So given that every year countries implement new policies, we take that into account into our new policy scenarios. So usually we take into account all the policies that have been announced until end of June, so 2019 for this new edition that we will publish in November. So that's why in the next edition that will be released in November, you should see different numbers compared to the ones that we have published last year. It's not because we think that our numbers were completely wrong, but fortunately it's because governments have put in place new policies that help to either reduce energy demand growth or to increase the share of renewables. So that's why you will see different numbers in November.
Thank you. Well, so thank you, everyone. We've had really good turnout, and it's really exciting to see so much interest from people in the region. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar has been recorded, and we'll post it online along with the presentations in Spanish, Portuguese, and English. We also will send around a survey. We'd be really interested to hear your feedback. The surveys really help us to target both the topics that we cover, as well as to get feedback on what information was useful, whether there was anything that wasn't clear, etc. So thank you in advance for your feedback, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.